Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. Breaking into the tomb of Henry VIII's sixth wife. On the 28th of February 1547, inside the Palace of Whitehall, Henry VIII, the infamous Tudor Monarch, died. Henry VIII's health and decline had been very severe, and in his final weeks and months he was in a lot of pain. He was waited on by the Archbishop of Canterbury, but the six-wived king left Catherine Parr, his final wife, behind. She is considered by some to have been the lucky wife who very easily could have been executed after she was considered a very radical Protestant at the time, and many people were suspicious at the effect she was having on the king and his religious beliefs. She was a skilled and brilliant scholar and talented woman, and she did a lot for women across England. But following the king's death, Catherine would marry quickly. She would marry a man who himself would be executed on Tower Hill, and who is often linked to the abuse of Elizabeth I, the future Tudor Queen. But following her death, her tomb and remains would be disturbed a number of times. But what is the story behind breaking into the tomb of Henry VIII's sixth wife? Catherine Parr was married to Henry VIII at Hampton Court on the 12th of July 1543, and she was the first Queen of England also to become the Queen of Ireland. She remained the Queen until her husband's death, and during his reign would also act as regent whilst Henry was away in France. She had a great influence on her stepdaughter, the future Elizabeth I, and she continued to publicise books and manuscripts. Shortly before Henry VIII died, he made an arrangement that would give Catherine an allowance of £7,000 a year to support herself, and he stated that she would be known as Queen Dowager, and treated as a Queen of England following his death. But shortly after Henry VIII's death, Catherine's old love and flame, Thomas Seymour, the first Baron of Sudley, would return to court, and the pair reunited their love, and very quickly. Seymour asked Catherine to marry him, and she accepted his proposal. Only 4 months had passed, and Seymour knew that he would not get the permission of the new king, Edward VI Regency Council, to marry the Queen Dowager so soon. So the pair married in secret, and the king and council were not told for a while, and when it became known there was a scandal. The king was not impressed, neither was his half-sister, the future Mary I. But at the time, Catherine began to become involved in altercations with her brother-in-law, Edward Seymour, the Lord Protector. He was the de facto ruler whilst the king was so young, but Seymour and Catherine would argue, especially as her husband Thomas wanted more power than his brother, and he got incredibly jealous. In her final years, she continued to write new books and volumes, but at an age of 35, Catherine became pregnant with Thomas Seymour's daughter. And this was a surprise, as throughout her first 3 marriages she had not conceived a child at all. This was a dangerous thing for a woman to give birth, especially during the Tudor period, as it was common for many mothers to die following childbirth from complications, blood loss or illness such as childbed fever. At the time, Catherine was living at Sudley Castle, where her husband owned, and this was a beautiful castle found in Gloucestershire. It was here where Catherine provided an education for Lady Jane Grey, the soon-to-be 9-day queen, following Edward VI's death. But whilst inside the rooms of Sudley Castle, Catherine spent her last few months within the walls of that castle. She spent the last summer of her life there, and whilst at Sudley, she gave birth to her only child, a daughter named Mary. The baby was born on the 30th of August 1548, but on the 5th of September, days after giving birth, Catherine succumbed to childbed fever inside of her bed. Following Catherine's death, Thomas Seymour left the castle quickly, but after her death her funeral was arranged, and it was the first Protestant funeral held in England, and her chief mourner was Lady Jane Grey. Her remains were not taken anywhere, and she was then buried inside of St Mary's Chapel, inside the grounds of the castle where she died. In the following month, her husband was executed for treason on Tower Hill, and her daughter seemingly disappeared from the history books over the next few years. A beautiful tomb for her was raised for her memory on the north side of the chapel, and it had an effigy of the Queen, and on the base was a Latin inscription. However, within 100 years of her death, the chapel fell into ruin and decay, and in 1642 the castle and chapel were damaged by fighting of the English Civil War. Roundhead soldiers arrived there and desecrated the chapel, and they even dug up the remains of the people buried there. and they smashed monuments and tombs, including Catherine Parr's. It's believed her body was disturbed at the time, and her monument was destroyed. A writer stated, "There in the castle a godly fair church, here they dug up the graves and disturbed the ashes of the death. They break down the monuments." Over the following years, Studley was slighted by Parliament, and the chapel roof was demolished, and for 2 centuries the chapel remained a ruin, and Catherine's burial place was forgotten. But in 1782, as many people flocked to see ruins of the castle, a group of ladies travelled to Studley, and they searched for the tomb of Henry VIII's 6th wife. They found a large block of alabaster in the north wall of the chapel, and then asked a group of local men to dig below it, and at a depth of around 2 feet, Catherine's lead coffin was found, and it was identified by its inscription. The coffin was then opened, the cerecloth covering the face of the Queen was cut away, and the people who had broken into Catherine Parr's tomb could not believe what they saw. They saw her perfectly preserved face and her open eyes, but then quickly her corpse, which had been exposed, had turned colour, and the eyes dimmed. Quickly the women then asked to throw earth back over the coffin. But the same year, a farmer who was curious also lifted the top off the coffin, and he saw the body wrapped in cerecloth. It was said, "In the summer of the year 1782, the earth in which Queen Parr lay interred was removed, and at the depth of about 2 feet, or very little more, her leaden coffin was found quite whole. Mr. Lucas had the curiosity to rip up the top of the coffin, expecting to discover within it only the bones of the deceased, but to his great surprise found the whole body wrapped in 6 or 7 cerecloth linen, entire and uncorrupted. His unwarranted curiosity led him to make an incision through the cerecloth, which covered one of the arms of the corpse, the flesh of what at the time was white and moist. He made an incision and uncovered one of the arms, and he said the flesh was white and moist, and he also cut off a few locks of the Queen's hair, as well as some material from the cloth and her dress, which she was buried in. In 1783, just a year later, the steward of the castle then directed for the grave to be opened again to see the Queen's remains, and it was said that the body had begun to decay quickly. It was noted that the shoes were on the feet, which were very small, and that the Queen's proportions were extremely delicate, and that her hair was gold. In 1786, a reverend opened the tomb again, and they found her body had totally decayed, and the teeth had fallen from their sockets. They opened one part of her arm and found her hand had turned brown, and they then made a sketch of the remains. It was said little respect had been paid to the Queen's remains, and over the next few years her tomb would be opened again. 6 years later, some rude people and vandals came to the castle and allegedly took the body out of the grave and played with it, and even danced with it before leaving it exposed in a heap of rubbish. It was said they were drunk, and they knocked out the teeth and stabbed an iron bar several times through Catherine Parr's torso, and then buried it back in the ground upside down. But then when the priest found it, he then petitioned to have the remains interred properly. The chapel was repaired in 1817, and Catherine's coffin was found upside down, and by now the body was just a heap of bones and small parts of hair. They were then placed inside of a stone vault, but it was believed that her remains were not given the correct historical respect fitting for the Queen and the final wife of Henry VIII. Her coffin was then placed into a beautiful and large marble tomb, which today sits inside of the chapel and can be viewed. On top is a large marble alabaster monument showing her with her hands clasped. And finally, Catherine Parr, the final wife of Henry VIII, is buried with a significant degree of dignity, despite the fact, because of antics of some others opening the coffin, very little of her actually remains there today. Catherine Parr is considered the 6th wife of Henry VIII, who during her time was a brilliant scholar and talented writer. She could have been living dangerously during Henry VIII's reign, but she managed to gain the favour of her husband when it mattered. Despite her being considered the lucky wife who managed to survive the wrath of her husband, after death her remains were treated certainly worse than most of Henry VIII's other wives. Today she's remembered for being a woman who championed education at a time when this was not expected of a woman, and she was the brilliant final wife of the infamous Henry VIII. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.